So, good morning. Welcome, everybody. We're having a few minutes just starting as we have participants come into the room. As is mentioned in the chat, we expect almost 700 people. We've got over 550, so welcome to you for making it in. Something slightly challenging with the settings. Everyone should have come straight into the room. We have got a waiting room which wasn't planned, so thanks to my colleagues for keeping to admit people as we go. Hopefully you're not getting notifications as that happens. Apologies if you are. We're very happy and excited to be here. I think this is one of our biggest, if not our biggest webinar yet. I hope everyone can see me. I will quickly spotlight myself. I'm getting messages. No, I'm confirmed that I can be seen. That's lovely. I need to just disable my chat. I've got a couple of messages going on in the background here as well. I will quickly, very quickly, just welcoming you and talk through some of the logistics for today. And then I'm going to be very, very quiet, and we're going to hand over to the person that you're all here to hear, Maury Gilland from D1, who will give us the view from the Commission, or at least from DG Regio, or at least from Maury's view of the world, as to what's been written down and what it means as now. A little bit of expectation management from my side as well. This is very much what's published, what's next. I think we're all desperate for more detail, more information. There's lots of questions. That's good. It's good to have questions. Some of the things that we have questions about might get answers at this stage. Some of the things might be noted for further discussions. So please don't be frustrated if you don't get detailed answers, either from Interact or from Maury and colleagues. I'm sure it's coming from a good place in terms of what can be said and when it can be said. So first warning to everybody is that the meeting is indeed recorded. Thank you, Regio, for
Okay, now we have a problem with the connection. Kevin.
Which of course can happen, and we were prepared for this situation. So I think let's bypass the introvert from Kevin and let's move directly to the presentation of Maury, because I think that's the most interesting part and the part that we've been all waiting for. So what do you say, Marco? Can we hand over the floor to the star of today and the main speaker?
Yeah, I think we can do that, and if Kevin is back soonish, so then we can turn back to him. But I think we can also hear Kevin's messages then at the end. So maybe we turn to Maury then. Maury, please, if you are ready.
I'm ready. The slide should be visible now.
Yes, we can confirm. We see it and we hear you well.
That's a good start. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today in your many hundreds, and welcome from my side to what will be the first of no doubt very, very many presentations and discussions on the post-2027 regulatory package and how that impacts Interreg. Now, you might think that this type of presentation is a very logical part of the process. At this point in time, the Commission should be out there explaining its proposals. And you would be right, up to a point. As soon as the Commission tabled its proposals, we moved into the formal interinstitutional legislative negotiation process. And that operates via the Council and the European Parliament. And indeed, Commission colleagues are in the next 30 minutes starting to present the new ERDF regulation to member states in Council for the very first time. And you'll notice that I'm not there. We have sent Oana along as my deputy to keep an eye on things, but we are not in the lead on this. Evidently, we have a unit inside DG Regional and Urban Policy that is in charge of overall policy development, and they lead on that type of work. More fundamentally, particularly this time round, there is a much stronger centralized coordination of the overall MFF and budget process. And indeed, for a number of the discussion areas, then it is actually our colleagues in DG Budget and the Secretariat General that are leading the discussions with member states and the Parliament. So there is that formal process which is going on, getting underway, and that is where the negotiation part of this process operates. That's where the content of the proposed regulations can be directly impacted. So, having set that scene a little bit, nevertheless, coming back to our meeting today, particularly in the context of Interreg, in our view, for Interreg to work effectively in the future, there needs to be a common understanding of what the new regulations mean, what they intend, how they can operate, and therefore, on this lovely Friday morning, you get to listen to me talking for the next 2 to 3 hours. Oh, lucky you. What I want to do is provide an overview of the content of the regulatory proposals rather, as they impact on Interreg, to explain, if you like, the mechanics of it, because, and we're very much aware of this, the package looks very, very different this time round to what we've seen previously. What I don't want to do, and I think this was some of the caveats that Kevin was going to add at the beginning before somebody tampered with his screen feed, we're evidently not going to be able to deal with every single question that you have in a morning session. We're also not going to go into a lot of detail on implementation mechanics. That's still a long, long way down the road. And we don't really want to put the cart before the horse. So it's more about, if you like, the regulatory content, the framework that is there that I want to try and focus on at this stage of the process. This is not going to be a rapid overall exercise. Last time round, the Commission published its proposals in May 2018, and the regulation content was agreed politically in December 2020, 2.5 years. And it took a further 6 months after that to finalize all of the translations and the revisions by the lawyer linguists to ensure that each of the translations meant the same thing in different languages. So it's a 3-year process last time round. All being well, we won't have COVID intervening this time, so it might be slightly quicker than that, but not that much. So there's a long process ahead. There will be plenty of time to discuss in more detail a lot of the mechanics of this. The knowledge fair coming up obviously will be one of the first opportunities to do that. But that's just to kind of try and set the framework, that today I want to really try and give you an overall picture of the shape of the regulatory process. And to do that, as you can see perhaps from the subtitle of the slide, I want to talk about continuity and change. And I want to do that because, firstly, it's clear that the structure and the mechanics and the layout of what's in the regulatory proposals has changed quite significantly compared to 21-27 and indeed previously. So I want to talk about the elements that have changed and how they have changed and explain a number of those to you. But the second half of the presentation is if you like, I could subtitle it the Murray-Gilland reassurance exercise. And that's to underline that a lot of the elements that we know and love about Interreg are still there and are still meant to be there. And that's the continuity dimension. And I want to pick up a number of those and demonstrate those in the text and offer, as I say, hopefully a degree of reassurance to all of you worried people out there. So that's the rationale. And getting underway then, as I said, with the change aspects that you will have all noticed when you were reading the regulations from cover to cover while you were lying on a beach during the summer holidays. So I've picked out a few bullet points here. You can see the summary list on the screen, and I'm now going to go through those step by step to demonstrate what we're talking about. And first, of course, what's changed from the mechanics point of view overall is the regulatory structure itself. And what we have is a three-layer process of regulations and implementing acts that I want to talk about in a bit more detail. Firstly, we have what I've called, I mean, these are my terms, the horizontal multi-annual financial framework regulations. That is the MFF regulation itself, which has always existed. It's usually a short 10, 15 article regulation, which has the allocation funding breakdown attached to it as an annex. So that is still there. And of course, it was accompanied in July when the Commission published with an overall political communication explaining the direction. The second horizontal MFF regulation, which is new and which will play a fundamental part, not just for Interreg, but for every part of the delivery of the EU budget in the future, is the snappily titled Performance Framework and Budget Tracking Regulation. Now this, for some parts of the budget, is quite new. If you, as Interreg people, sit down and read that regulation, you will recognize a lot of it, because a lot of it is based on previous cohesion policy experience. So it's talking about intervention fields, indicators, spending requirements, even visibility requirements are included in there as well. And a lot of these are actually very strongly inspired from previous cohesion policy rules and have been lifted up to the level of the MFF so that they apply right across the budget. The second layer of legislation are the Parliament and Council regulations. And there are two key ones that we need to look at here. And of course, because this is the Commission and because it's the European Union, we've also had to invent new acronyms to go along with them. So we have the NRP regulation, the National and Regional Partnership Plans regulation, which is broadly the equivalent of the Common Provisions regulation from 21-27. I say broadly equivalent because its coverage is, of course, expanded. It now covers agriculture. It covers a total budget of around 800 billion euros. So it's much expanded from that point of view. And it creates a very different structure to what we're used to under cohesion policy, with all of the funding under that NRP regulation to be delivered through 27 plans, one per member state. With inside that plan, individual chapters corresponding to what we currently know as programs, be they cohesion policy or agriculture or fisheries or whichever part of the funding is covered by that. There are parts of that NRP regulation which do impact on Interreg. And elements including the budget, etc., are established there. But it's an important point to emphasize that when that regulation talks about NRP plans, national, regional, and partnership plans, that does not include Interreg. Those are the national 27 plans. Interreg is not covered by those. Then we have the ERDF Cohesion Fund Regulation, or as I like to refer to it, the ERDF Cohesion Fund and Interreg Regulation. And that's because if you actually look at it, more than half the content of that regulation is in fact Interreg. Now, without going into too much detail about the internal commission dynamics on this, the structure here of these regulations was developed very late on. On the Thursday before the Commission adoption of the proposals, so on the Thursday, the 10th of July, the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation didn't exist. And there were no what we call fund-specific regulations as of Thursday, the 10th of July. If you remember, the evening before, President von der Leyen was involved in detailed negotiations with the European Parliament, and the outcome of those negotiations was that there would be fund-specific regulations. Now, that meant that those fund-specific regulations were basically developed over the weekend. And to a certain extent, that is visible when you look at the content. They're very short, they're very summary in content, particularly in comparison to the 21-27 period. So I've noted here it's evidently the equivalent of the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation, but it's certainly not identical. And one of the most fundamental parts of that is that, as I said, over half half of that proposed regulation is actually on Interreg. And right up till that last reorganization over that last weekend in the preparation, those Interreg articles were actually going to be in the NRP regulation. There was going to be a separate section dealing with Interreg there, and at the last minute they were moved into the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation. That doesn't change a lot on the dynamic, because these are the same level. These are Parliament Council regulations. These are the ones that are going to be negotiated with the Council and with the European Parliament over the coming years. Now, the obvious question, and I see one or two people already kind of touching on this in the chat, is now, hang on a second, if I look at the Interreg regulation for 21-27, it's about 60 articles. And if I look at the proposed ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation, there are about 7 articles on Interreg. Where's the other 55 articles, is the question. And we come to the Interreg plan. And this is one of the biggest presentational changes that we've seen in the delivery of Interreg. And I want to take quite a bit of time here to talk through what is going on here. As the internal preparations were going on what the future MFF would look like, and particularly in the development of that NRP regulation proposal, we were reaching a situation where hundreds of billions of euros were going to be delivered through 27 country plans, which would mean 27 Commission decisions. And that was it, procedurally. It was going to be difficult, and it was going to be awkward for us then to come along and to knock at the door of whoever's in charge at Central Services and the Commission and say, we're going to have about 10 billion euros on Interreg, but we still want 90 separate decisions. So you were running into the ever-present simplification discussion, whereby if we can adopt 800 billion euros through 27 decisions, why on earth would we need 90 separate decisions for Interreg for around 10 billion? So we had to take account of the simplification dynamic that was happening as part of the MFF preparations. And this is the starting point for the creation of the idea of the Interreg plan. Well, if we're going to have country plans, one for each country, covering all of this, why don't we have an Interreg plan? A single plan covering how Interreg is delivered. Now, these can't be, and this of course was one of the points that was raised very strongly all the way through the consultation exercise over the last couple of years, there's no way that this can be national. It's completely counterintuitive to try and talk nationally in a context of Interreg and cooperation. Therefore, how about we have a single structure for Interreg? Now, what goes inside it is then the question. And there are broadly two parts to the Interreg plan in the Commission proposal. Firstly, there is what we call a general part, and the text that you can see in bold on the screen is, I think, a quote from that regulation in Article 9 of the ERDF regulation. And what we mean by detailed arrangements covering the specific implementation modalities of Interreg are the missing articles from the current Interreg regulation. So this is where, inside the Implementing Act, we will be able to include some of the elements handling eligibility, small project funds, the mechanics that you do not find if you read the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation proposal will be able to be picked up and included in the general part of the Interreg plan. The second part of the Interreg plan is how we address the adoption question. I've emphasized the point that we need to look at an overall simplification dynamic. Therefore, we're looking at a single decision to adopt the delivery of Interreg rather than 90 separate program decisions. So the idea developed that, well, we simply attach each Interreg program to the Interreg plan, and then when you adopt the Interreg plan, you're adopting all the programs. Of course, Interreg programs can be quite long. Many of them are over 100 pages. If we have 90 Interreg programs that are over 100 pages each attached to the Interreg plan is going to be over 10,000 pages long, possibly not fitting with the simplification dynamic. And therefore, the idea developed that, well, maybe the Commission doesn't need to adopt 100 pages of cooperation detail for every single Interreg program. Maybe the Commission only needs to adopt the core necessary information. And this is where the concept of a summary chapter was developed. And there is a template attached to the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation showing the core information that the Commission wants to adopt for each of the Interreg programs. And in this way, with a 5 or 10 page summary for each program, we end up with an Interreg plan, which will still be about 1,000 pages. Let's not hide that, but at least it won't be 10,000 pages. Now, I've already seen comments and some questions from people saying, but it's absolutely impossible for us to summarize everything down to 5-10 pages. My first reaction to that is it? Is it really impossible? Or is it just because we've always worked that way? The second aspect, and this is an important point to underline, is that Interreg programs, cohesion policy programs, have always produced documents that are not required by the regulations. Many Interreg programs, if not all, produce a program manual. Many Interreg programs produce a detailed call for projects with each individual call that they publish. None of that is required in the regulation. None of that has ever been required in a regulation, but programs have developed it because they see it as necessary for functioning. So, even if the Commission's proposal means that we only want to adopt a summary chapter of 5 to 10 pages with core information, that doesn't stop each Interreg program actually writing a full program document if they want. And indeed, my expectation would be that most programs would probably go in that direction, because they would want to agree a comprehensive document about how they are going to cooperate post 2027, and then they will extract the core information to insert it in the summary chapter that needs to be sent to the Commission. It's a major change in how we've functioned. We don't hide that at all. It doesn't fundamentally change the way programs work. Programs can continue to operate by producing a program document, by discussing the details of that program document, by agreeing how they're going to implement their programs. It's just that the amount of detail that the Commission will legally adopt is going to be much, much shorter and more compact than we've seen before. And through that, we have a narrative that we can use to talk to the member states, to talk to the council, to talk to the parliament, to talk to other parts of the Commission, let's be honest about it, about how Interreg is contributing to the simplification process for the next MFF. So that's a lot of what we're trying to achieve here. Now, a couple of questions, a couple of comments just on procedure, and this still needs to be teased out to be operating in detail. At the point the Interreg plan is adopted for the first time, maybe the Commission hasn't received all of the chapters from all of the programs. So what happens? Well, quite simply, we adopt the plan with the chapters that are ready. So let's say we've received 40 chapters from member states at that point in time from programs, and then we adopt the plan with 40 annexes. And those programs are ready to go. 3 months later, another 30 programs have sent in their chapters. What do? We simply modify the Interreg plan. It's a single article saying the 30 annexes attached to this decision are now attached to the Interreg plan. And then they're just slotted in through a straightforward modification. And then those 30 new chapters are adopted. Halfway through the programming period, everything is running very smoothly, as it always does with Interreg, and one program comes forward and says, actually, we want to change 1 or 2 things in our chapter summary, because one part of our program isn't functioning properly, we want to move money, etc. We'd like a modification of our part of the Interreg plan. How does that happen? The program authorities send their request for a change, they send their revised chapter, Commission looks at it and says, this is fine. Again, we simply do a single modification decision on the Interreg plan. And we say Annex 17 of the Interreg plan is replaced by the annex attached to this modification decision. And that way the chapters swap in and out, and you have a revised chapter approved. So it creates a single structure, the Interreg plan, which covers how replaces, if you like, the classic approach of program adoption 1 by 1, program modification 1 by 1. And as I say, it ties in with a significant, we hope, simplification dynamic with the wider MFF exercise. We recognize this is very new. We recognize that there will need to be more explanations of this, but hopefully that this is a reasonably clear starting explanation about the concept of the Interreg plan itself. In parallel to that, and you can see here the bullet points at the end. I've sketched out how the plan would be adopted and dealt with. You have the ongoing regulatory process that I touched on at the beginning with the European Parliament and Council. Now, one of the questions that you will certainly have is, can we come back to the first part of the Interreg plan, the general part, those articles that you're talking about that we haven't seen yet? When do we see them? That's a very good question. The answer for today is, I don't know. But the political reality, I think, is that a draft element of that part of the Interreg plan would need to be shared with member states and the Parliament relatively early. Because clearly, member states and the Interreg community are going to want to know what is in that part of the Interreg plan before they're ready to agree to the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation. Because you're not going to be ready to agree to the 6 or 7 articles in the ERDF Cohesion Fund regulation until you know what's coming in stage 2 in the Interreg plan. So that's something that still needs to be discussed in detail inside the Commission about the timing and the proposal of that. But we're aware that that needs to be visible, it needs to be shared so that people have a full picture of the regulatory requirements for the delivery of Interreg. Continuing on then on the change aspect, I've included the objectives aspect in the change dimension because again the presentation is fairly fundamentally changed compared to the previous period. Here you need to look at the NRP regulation, articles 2 and 3 in particular, and firstly the general objectives are set out in Article 2 of the NRP regulation. However, if you look at these, although they're called general objectives in the proposal, they're essentially the equivalent of the former funds. So point A is cohesion policy, point B is agriculture, point C is the social fund, even though they are presented as general objectives, essentially they equate to what we would have called the funds in the past. The specific objectives in Article 3 of the NRP regulation are much more detailed. They're broken down in relation to the general objectives in Article 2, and they are very long, they are very detailed, they look more like the approach that we had in 2014-2020 than the approach that we had in 21-27. But they do offer more options, more examples, which is it's an interesting case of how thinking rotates and circulates from period to period. Our approach last time in 21-27 was to avoid as much as possible examples, because the danger with having a listing of examples of actions is that you miss something out. And you know, for 21-27 we went for these much broader, more innovative Europe, more connected Europe, greener Europe, because that gave you a broader headline and more flexibility within it. So it seems that things are coming full circle and we're going back to more levels of detail here. We also have 3 Interreg specific objectives proposed this time around. We have continuity on cooperation governance, on safer and more secure Europe, and we have a new specific objective in relation to more resilient regions bordering Russia, Belarus and Ukraine. There is, and a number of people have already spotted this, a degree of wording incoherence in the proposal in relation in the ERDF Cohesion Fund proposal between Recital 13 and Article 7.4 of the regulation. Article 7.4 emphasises that Interreg can deal with the specific objectives linked to points A and C of Article 2 of the NRP. That's the cohesion policy and the social aspect. Recital 13 seems to suggest that Interreg can deal with all the specific objectives. So that's one of the elements I think that, how shall I put it, needs to be teased out over the coming months about exactly what is intended in that kind of situation. If I were being unkind, which of course I never am, but if I were being unkind, perhaps that might be one of the wording issues that comes from trying to write a regulation in 3.5 days over a weekend. Who knows? One of the most fundamental changes in the proposal is that there is no longer the concept of thematic concentration. Now this is part of a more extended approach for the whole MFF. There was a distinct reluctance to have the idea that different bits of the overall MF proposal should be ring-fenced for different areas of spending. That was not what was wanted. One of the core aims this time round is to have an MFF that is flexible, that is adaptable, that can change direction during the implementation period in order to address unexpected shocks and events. So the rationale there is if you have thematic concentration which says you have to spend this much on innovation, you have to spend this much on transport, you have to spend this, etc., then you don't have flexibility because you've set up a legal requirement about limitations. So this is the rationale for the disappearance of thematic concentration. What we do have is a single percentage target for climate and environment objectives at the level of the entire budget. And because it's a percentage that is established at the level of the entire budget, it's included in the performance framework regulation. If you remember from my first slide, that MFF level regulation, the new regulation on performance framework. That 35% overall target for the budget, of course, is not a flat rate for everybody. Clearly, depending on what you're spending on and what your content is, that can go up and down. And in Annex 3 of the performance regulation, there is a summary set of percentages which says that external funding in the budget has to contribute a certain amount and some of the other areas have to contribute as well. And that Annex 3 explicitly says that the NRP plans have to contribute 43% on climate and environmental objectives, obviously because they tend to spend more on climate and environmental issues, so they have to spend more than the average of 35%. The interesting point for us today, as you can see in the slide, is because Annex 3 explicitly says that's an NRP target, Interreg is not an NRP plan. Therefore, that 35% or that 43% target technically doesn't apply to Interreg. We obviously will still expect Interreg programs to spend significant amounts of money on climate and environment, but based on the Commission proposal, there is not a specific percentage target attached to that in the text. Another element we just wanted to flag up was a specific paragraph included in Article 7, you can see at the bottom of the slide, where there is the possibility of the Interreg plan covering cooperation between non-member states. Now this, as you may see from the rest of the text, hasn't been developed in any great detail, but it leaves a door open for the idea that, well, potentially then the cross-border cooperation between Serbia and North Macedonia could form a chapter and could be attached to the Interreg plan in the same way as the Interreg chapters involving member states. So it creates a possibility, it creates a hook. It's something that would have to be looked at, obviously, in a lot more detail, because again, it's something where, you know, is perhaps not being fully developed in the actual proposal, but it is there. Two key elements that we've talked about a lot during the consultation process, and which we will continue to talk about a lot in the future, I am absolutely sure, on delivery aspects, are the areas of reform and the performance-based approach. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail today. I just want to flag these up. On the performance-based approach, this is the direction of travel of the entire MFF. There is a clear and unambiguous desire from the Commission side and a requirement on the basis of the regulations to move away from a fixation on expenditure-based delivery and to move towards performance-based delivery. And you can see that in the proposal, in the details in Article 8, with each Interreg chapter as part of its core information needing to contain a list and a description of the measures that are to be supported, the milestones and targets that they need to deliver, the estimated costs about how much those measures are going to be set out, and that's what the payments will be based on during the lifetime of the Interreg implementation. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done on this behind the scenes in the last months and indeed couple of years, and it's still something that needs to develop, because this is going to be a fundamental change in approach for the delivery of Interreg in the future. Parallel to that is the question of reforms. Again, this is a core area for the Commission in relation particularly to the NRP plans, the country plans, this linking more tightly than ever before between investment and reforms, building on what the Recovery and Resilience Facility has done. And what we've tried to emphasize here in the context of Interreg is that the classic understanding of reforms doesn't really work in an Interreg context. So the reform of the justice system, the reform of pensions, the reform of national labour markets, etc., none of that fits directly with Interreg because, of course, we're multi-country. Nevertheless, it's an area where we need more reflection, and we need to look at how Interreg can contribute, if it can contribute, to the reform dimension. And we need to do it for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the right thing to do. It's to look at how we reform the delivery of public services and the living conditions of people living in cooperation areas, cross-border or transnational or whatever. And secondly, which is slightly more cynical, we need to fit into the overall narrative, the driving narrative behind the Commission's proposals and the direction of what the EU budget is going to do. And one of the points that I've emphasized a number of times in the relation to the reform discussion is that actually, if you look at a number of things that Interreg does and does well, they are actually very reform focused. It's simply that they have never been described like that. They've never been sold like that in the past. And the two examples that I talk about are often cross-border healthcare and cross-border public transport services. We have lots of projects in both areas where we talk about how do we have health services on both sides of the border cooperate to offer services shared services to the cross-border population, which saves everybody money, which means that you don't duplicate services on either side of the border. Or on the transport side, how do we make sure that we get the train companies talking to the bus companies, and we get common timetables and common ticketing and all of these kind of things? We do a lot of that already, and we do it well. We never describe them as reforms, but that's exactly what they are. You're reforming the delivery of cross-border healthcare. You're reforming the delivery of cross-border public transport. So part of our reflection in the reform area needs to be about not just how on earth do we fit reforms into this kind of discussion. It's actually, how about we look at what we're doing and seeing maybe we're actually doing reforms, it's just that we never used that word in the past. Now that won't fit with everybody, let's be clear, and there's not an obligation included in the regulatory proposals precisely for that reason. That kind of reform dimension that I'm talking about on healthcare or public transport is going to be more challenging on an external border than an internal border, for example. It may be more difficult to fit that reform dynamic in a transnational or an interregional program than it is in a cross-border program. So again, it's not that there's going to be a standardized approach, there's not going to be a standardized requirement here, but we'd like to see evidence of people thinking creatively on that reform aspect. I wanted to emphasize an important point in the Commission's proposals in relation to the outermost region cooperation strand. Hopefully all of you are aware that we are currently, for the first time ever, running a couple of test cases in both the Madeira, Azores, Canaries program and the Indian Ocean program, where small amounts of external funding in the EU budget in this period are being added into those programs. So for the first time ever, we have a combination of ERDF and external funding inside the outermost region cooperation programs, in the same way as we already have in the Interreg IPA programs or the Interreg Next programs. And this is very much a test case in 21-27. We have a very unusual approach in that that money is maintained as indirect management rather than shared management. Because of the nature of the partners that we're cooperating with in these programs, we felt shared management with Madagascar or the Ivory Coast was probably overambitious at this stage in the process. So we have an indirect management, which is possible under the regulation, maintained. In the proposal from the Commission, this is one of the areas where we have emphasised that this should take place from the start of the programming period, in the same way as it does on other external borders of the Union, so that that funding is available at the beginning from the external instrument, the new Global Europe instrument, as it's proposed to be called, and therefore you would have that joint ERDF external budget from the beginning, as we have on other borders. Final elements of change, as part of my proposal at least, or presentation. And these are some of the ones that might scare people the most, let's be honest about it. Firstly, on pre-financing, the proposal is that there would be 4% per year for the first 3 years. Now that actually ends up as being less than Interreg has at the moment, because Interreg currently has 14% across 6 years of pre-financing, so this would be 12% over 3. It does mean that the pre-financing is closer to the beginning of the period, which kind of fits better with the actual meaning of the word pre-financing. It's an area that, even at this early stage, is likely to be the subject of much discussion with the Council and Parliament. This is one of the areas where the European Parliament in 21-27 pushed extremely strongly. The reason that Interreg ended up with 14% as a pre-financing total was very much down to the European Parliament's approach. Also in the Commission's proposals is that there is the possibility of specific pre-financing rules along the external borders of the Union can be set out in the Interreg plan. And this is, of course, intended to very much enable a continuity with the current pre-financing rules that exist for Interreg IPA or Interreg Next, because they've always had a separate set of pre-financing rules, and that's one of the areas that we would want to be addressing in the Interreg plan. Tucked away in Article 15 of the NRP regulation proposal is the completely and utterly uncontroversial idea of moving to an N+10 months process for automatic decommitment. For my own safety and security and sanity, I am not going to say any more on that at all. I've seen a lot of incredulous reactions from member states thus far. I would imagine that this will be one of the most hotly discussed parts of the regulation. Let me say no more than that. I do note, however, that with the pre-financing point higher up, with the pre-financing more compressed to the beginning of the period, and also with the possibility of performance-based payments earlier in the programme period, then there is the possibility, because of other parts of the proposal, for more funding to flow to programmes earlier in the programming period than might be the case now. Whether those are sufficient to compensate for the concept of N+10 months is something that your programmes, your member states, and your discussions with the European Parliament will have to reflect on. Let me leave it there. There's another important aspect that I wanted to underline, which for some reason we were told not to write down on the slide, so I'll simply say it orally. In the MFF regulation, remember the regulation I talked about at the beginning, there has always been a clause which says that if a cohesion policy programme could not be adopted in the first year of a programming period, which was very often the case because the regulations usually come so late. If it was not possible to adopt a programme in that first year, then the money for the first year, that tranche for that first year, can be carried over to another year. Sometimes to the next year, sometimes it's spread across several years. It's important to underline that that clause is not included this time round. So if you have an NRP plan for a member state which is not adopted in 2028 and is only going to be ready in 2029, based on the Commission's proposal, the 2028 money for that country is lost. There is no carryover possibility included in the Commission proposal. Now, I used the example there of an NRP plan facing that situation because the other aspect that's important to underline, but here I imagine most people have spotted it in an Interreg context, is in the Commission proposal, there is no funding for Interreg in 2028. The funding starts in 2029. Now, we have asked our budget colleagues why. We have not received an answer that is full of clarity, shall I say. Part of the answer we got was, well, if you look at the start of the 21-27 period, there was absolutely no expenditure in Interreg in 2021, and none of the programs were approved until 2022. Which is technically correct, But that's also true for the whole of cohesion policy. And they have included cohesion policy money for 2028. So it's a partial answer, but it's not an exact answer. Our response on some of the internal discussions have been, have you seen our execution rate for Interreg? We're over 70% committed to projects now. Most programs are going to be finished earlier than they've ever been before, and they're going to be ready to start the next programming period. And if you're delaying everything by 12 months, we're losing an advantage that we have gained from the effective implementation of the 21-27 period. I think this is something that will also be the subject of much discussion during the negotiations on the regulations. That's all I can say at this moment. Watch this space. But it's important for people to be aware that at the moment, the first commitment for Interreg, based on the Commission's proposal, would come in 2029. Okay, that's the change aspect of the overall process. I'm now moving into the reassurance mode and talking about what is there from a continuity aspect. And again, I'm going to try and go element by element, because even if there's broad continuity, there are still some changes in the mechanics, etc. But I hope you notice that this list of continuity aspects is longer than the list of change aspects in the first part of the presentation. Okay. First up, money. All about the money. Now, I've included this actually in the continuity aspect, but I could, if I wanted to, have put it in the change aspect and said change for the better because we've got more money. But I tend to include it here under continuity because there was a lot of discussion and concern that we might struggle to maintain the same level of funding as we've had, and in actual fact, things have moved up. So comparing like with like is always a little bit of a challenge. But under 21-27, ERDF for Interreg totals 8.9 billion in current prices. The proposal from the Commission from July puts on the table 10.3 billion for Interreg in current prices. So on a like-for-like comparison, that's quite a reasonable jump. The allocation methodology proposed, which is set out in Annex 3 of the NRP regulation, is identical to the 21-27 methodology. So that combination of border population, total population, outermost region population, and the weighting between them to arrive at an amount per country. There's no specific amount identified for Strand C, because of course that's never broken down by member states, because it's all member states are involved in Strand C. So that is still to come. And linked to the funding discussion, we have the strands, the 4 strands A, B, C, D are continued unchanged. And also on the concept of partnership in the programs, the partnership process rolls over essentially unchanged requirements from 21-27 as well. On programs and program continuity, we have a slight linguistic challenge in relation to the word program now, because of course what's the Commission going to be approving is going to be chapters, as we saw earlier in the presentation. So we sometimes get a little bit already caught up in, are we talking about Interreg programs, are we talking about Interreg chapters, etc. My own approach tends to be that a chapter is part of a document. So when we talk about an Interreg chapter, we're talking about the group of pages that the Commission is approving. When we're talking about the partnership, the cross-border or the transnational partnership that are delivering cooperation, the authorities, the systems, the projects themselves. We're talking about an Interreg program as a whole. So you will still hear me use the word program a lot. Our expectation is that all of the current programs will continue into the next period. The Commission's view, I think it's fair to say, has significantly evolved since the last set of proposals were tabled in 2018. And we would like to emphasise, as has been done through the consultation exercise with the programmes, the importance of continuity for cooperation purposes in relation to developing partnership, developing trust and relationship in cooperation. There is a need to continue and maintain what is there. So it is not intended that the Commission is going to be proposing changes to program geography and structures in the overall process. Now, if programs want to change geographies themselves, then that's something that, of course, they can come and talk to the Commission about. That's again, if it's coming from a desire and an internal aim and objective, then that's absolutely fine to be discussing. But it's not something that the Commission sees a logical rationale for a push from the Commission side. So I hope that eases quite a lot of concerns. On the program mechanics and the structures, again, if you read through the proposals, you will see very much continuity with what is there. So a managing authority for each program, an audit authority, a joint secretariat, a group of auditors covering the countries involved. There's one or two small changes in the wording. We don't explicitly talk about a separate accounting function anymore. Again, that's part of the simplification, removing that specific reference. But of course, it's still possible for a managing authority to delegate some of the tasks to another body to carry them out if they want to. Monitoring committee for each chapter, for each program, remains fundamental to the effective delivery of Interreg. And again, that continues. Our intention being that the details about how a monitoring committee functions, the tasks and responsibilities of the monitoring committee are elements that we would want to set out in the Interreg plan. Again, picking up the articles that currently exist in the Interreg regulation. Similarly, while in the proposals there's no explicit mention of the national authority for non-member states in the external border programs, our intention there is to address that question inside the Interreg plan as well. Creating the concept and the responsibilities for the national authorities. Co-financing is essentially retained at its existing levels. Presentation is reversed. Don't ask me why, please. I don't quite follow this. Rather than talking about the EU co-financing rate, we're now talking about the national co-financing rate. So instead of saying 80% EU co-financing for Interreg, we say 20% national co-financing for Interreg. You can argue about using the adjective national in the context of cooperation programs doesn't make a lot of sense, but again, there's only so far we can go in these kind of things. So 80% for Interreg, 85% for the outermost cooperation, and cross-border cooperation on external borders. Now, I've seen one question come up several times already, and I wanted to address that now. When we're talking about co-financing for cooperation on external borders, it's for cooperation across external borders. So the 85 co-financing rate would be for Poland, Ukraine, because it's across an external border. But it's not for Estonia, Latvia, because that's cooperation between two member states. On technical assistance, we've retained the flat rate approach that was introduced in 21-27, but we've tried to simplify its delivery. Because if you read the technical assistance article for 21-27, there are a number of subcategories which got more and more confusing. So we've tried to really streamline this. So basically, it's an 8% flat rate across all Interreg. with the exception of outermost region and again cooperation on external borders, which could get 10%. On external border funding itself, the intention is to continue the approach that we have under the Interreg IPA and Interreg Next. So again, funding will be identified early on in the process to come across from Global Europe. It will be added to the ERDF that member states identify for these cooperation programs, and the money is then added together, fused into a single Interreg amount, and that can be spent anywhere in the program area. Of course, we'll need to get used to not talking about Interreg IPA and Interreg Next in the future, because IPA Next won't exist in the post-2028 period. All we have is the Global Europe instrument, because all the external funding has been merged into one pot. One point, again, I've seen a couple of questions on in relation to some of the wording in Article 11. Generally, in the past, when we talked about the funding on the external borders, we've talked about matching funding. And particularly that's in the rationale of the cross-border programs. So if a member state allocates a certain amount for one of its external cross-border programs, the assumption is that the external funds of the Commission of the EU should provide a matching amount. So it's roughly 50-50. The wording in the Commission proposal talks about proportionate amounts. And that is included because we also need to talk about transnational cooperation across the external border and also now the outermost region programs. And for some of those programs, it's not really appropriate to ask for a matching amount. If I can take one example of the Danube program, it's roughly speaking 80% member state. So it's not realistic that you would ask for a 50-50 treatment in that. You were asking for a proportionate contribution for the involvement of the various non-member states involved in that cooperation. So that's the rationale behind the use of the adjective proportionate. I know one or two people have been worried about that, but there is a clear rationale behind that. On audit and management verifications, I don't want to go into too much detail at this stage here, but the fundamental message, if you like, is that the work of the audit authority and the group of auditors, the audit work that they carry out, the work carried out as management verifications remains essentially the same, except that the verifications and audit will be on the fulfillment of milestones and targets, not on the actual expenditure. So you will still be looking to see, is this being done correctly? But you'll be looking at it about milestones and targets, not on, my goodness, you spent €1.60 on how many metro tickets? That kind of thing. So it's moving away, as I said earlier on, from the expenditure focus and looking at the milestone and targets focus. These aspects, during the preparations, some of the mechanics were too detailed to get set out in the Commission proposals at this stage. Again, these are aspects that can be picked up and included in the Interreg plan, picking up the articles that we already have in the current Interreg regulation. And one final slide from my side before I stop and take a drink of water, is on Peace Plus. In the 21-27 period, there are a number of references to Peace Plus that are spread out broadly across the Interreg regulation, because essentially they are referred to when they needed to be referred to. So the rules about working with a non-member state, the UK in this case, were in one part of the regulation. The flexibility in relation to the content, what the Peace Plus program could support were included in the eligibility and the objectives element. So they were spread out a little bit across the regulation. What we did here was we pooled all of these together into a single article. So that all of the Peace Plus rules, if you like, are regrouped in a single place. We haven't changed those rules, so there is very much continuity with the existing approach, so that the explicit extension, if you like, that exists for the Peace Plus program, allowing them to go beyond purely cross-border activities to support peace and reconciliation actions, to support cross-community activities, even if they fall inside a single country. All of that is retained. We've proposed the same approach in relation to the external funding, in that the idea is that the United Kingdom would pay into the EU budget under something which is called external assigned revenue. It would then be added to the allocation coming from Interreg, and that would then form a single allocation back to the Peace Plus program. That's the same as happens now. The one difference, and this comes back to the point I made earlier about no ring fencing in the budget, no setting aside specific pots of money for specific areas. There's not an additional separate allocation for Peace Plus as part of the Commission proposal. Last time round, there's a allocation under Interreg for Ireland. Ireland could choose how much to put onto Peace Plus, how much to put onto the transnational programs. And on top of that, in the Commission proposal in 2018, we put on the table, I think, a total amount of 120 million explicitly for the Peace Plus program on top. That explicit allocation doesn't exist in the Commission proposal. The funding for Peace Plus needs to be drawn from the Irish share of the Interreg program on the basis of the Commission proposal. So that was where we stand after the proposals in July. Hopefully that gives you a feeling, an overview of the rationale behind the whole process. I very much, as I said, tried to emphasize the continuity aspects. There is a lot in this mechanic where at program level, the hope is that you would not see so many fundamental changes in the process. How you operate, how you function with authorities, with the monitoring committee, with calls for projects, etc., should very much be continuity with what you have now. There are changes in the overall structure, in the system, in the approval process at the Commission level, and that's elements that we will need to continue to look in detail at over the coming months. But given, I think, what is fair to describe as the quite significant uncertainty in the discussions that we saw in 2024 and early 2025 about where the EU budget was going, what might happen to different parts of the budget. The fact that we come out of the Commission proposals in July with more money for Interreg than ever before, with a proposal that is recognisably confirming the continuity and importance of cooperation across borders, I think we have to be very positive about. And yes, there's still a lot to be discussed. There always is in this kind of exercise, but I think we can be all quietly happy with what's come out of that process, and that we have a very strong basis to build on and to take through the overall negotiation process of regulations, programs and chapters in the months to come. So thank you very much for listening. I will hand back perhaps to Kevin if his connection has restarted. Very good. And as I say, I will hand back and I'll take a quick drink. Thank you very much.
Perfect, Mari. I promise to speak just for a minute to give you a little bit of a break to actually have a second and take a please do take a breath, because you're not finished yet. We have questions for you, obviously. If you have checked out the chat recently, you've been nudged to rejoin the Q&A. We've got lots of questions in the Q&A already. I've taken a couple of batches together and I'll ask them to Maury in a second. We're going to start by just going over some things that Maury has said, just to make sure the question's answered and everyone's got it, but it also helps me just clear out a few points and make sure I'm aware exactly of where we are. So please do navigate to the top. You can find the Q&A button very easily at the top. It's, for my screen, it's the third one. For yours, it might only be the second. It depends on your team settings and how you've joined. It's next to the people, though. So if you can see a big number, 636 of us in the room having a discussion together. So just being completely candid, there won't be opening cameras or opening microphones beyond Maury and myself, likely. And please use the Q&A to upvote things. Now, I hope, Maury, you've had a second to actually take a breath and have a little bit of a drink.
A little bit.
I'm going to turn cameras back on so I can see. We have a little bit of an issue from your camera from time to time. I obviously have my own technical issues as well. But hopefully the internet copes with the importance of this meeting. And I'm going to start just by asking you a few questions about the Interreg plan, particularly, just to come over a few of the things you said, make sure we understand clearly, correctly, and just to share that understanding. First question, these are going to go through a little bit of an order, so just bear with me in a second. If you're asked a more interesting question, that will come in a second. In terms of the summary chapters and their submission, is there anything you know about who needs to pre-approve them? Similar to the program documents, is there anything that's changed based on the current regulations into the future?
I think the straightforward answer at this stage is no. I mean, if you go back, if you look at the current period, there's no explicit rules about how you put a program together for the 21-27 period. We don't explicitly regulate for the requirement for a programming committee or how those structures are put together, etc. And, you know, as I tried to emphasize in the presentation, my thinking is that most programs will probably still take the same approach, will still put together a program document in the same way. It's just that the one extra step right at the end will be extracting the core information that needs to go into the chapter and creating that little chapter. So I don't see, again, you know, for me, this is one area where if the chapter aspect is a significant change in the mechanics, the actual steps up to that process will probably form part of the continuity exercise as well.
Perfect. That's what I understood, so I'm glad I understood. Hopefully it was clear for everybody else. And then I've got three more quick ones for you. Interreg chapters only appear in the Interreg plan. They're not in an RP either. Is that correct?
Absolutely, 100% correct.
Okay, I said three easy ones. The next one might not be, sorry. How many chapters are foreseen?
Give me 1 second, Kevin. The answer to that lies in the point that I made about continuity in the programming process. So if, as I said, we expect continuity with the existing programs, then you would expect each of those programs to be putting forward their chapters for the future. Now, there is the possibility for people to come forward and, as I said, talk about potential geography changes to existing programs. And there's the theoretical possibility of people thinking about new programs. So, you know, nothing is fixed in absolute stone on that kind of situation, but the simple answer is currently we have 86 programs. We would expect the number of chapters to be there or thereabouts.
Perfect. So nothing changed in theory unless somebody changes it, maybe. Then there's kind of two questions now on the timelines that you've mentioned. So just again, going over this, the question came is there a minimum number of chapters you would need in order to actually push the first version of the Interreg plan, or would you publish even if you only had one? If the first program was ready, would that be enough? And connected to that, in terms of the revisions, again, is there a minimum number, or would it be kind of they're published every time on this 3-monthly basis?
Working backwards, on the revisions, I think honestly it's too difficult to say at the moment. We'd have to see how things develop. I mean, there's a possibility that we might end up with fewer changes than we've ever had in the past, because if the chapters are 5 to 10 pages, they may need less modification, because it's not the same as having a 100-page document where small things might change from page to page every now and again. So if we end up with fewer changes, maybe it will end up in the case that every time we get a request, we put through a modification because we don't know when the next one's coming. But that, I think we would probably end up having to play that by ear. Right at the beginning of the process, I think it's also something that we need to look at a little bit more procedurally. There's a possibility, but again, as I say, none of this is really fixed yet. There's a possibility that we might actually have to adopt the first version of the Interreg plan with no chapters attached, because there could be, from a legal point of view, we might need the first part, the general part with the articles, the regulatory elements, that might need to be legally adopted before anybody can send a chapter. Because otherwise, how do the programs, how do the member states know what legal requirements they're fulfilling? So there might be a couple of things that we need to see there. And again, it will also depend as we, on the overall timing, how fast all of this moves. Which is a kind of longer way of saying I don't know, but there you go. I'm just going to need to take a 2-minute break, Kevin, so I don't know if you can infill in the meantime, possibly.
Yep, I absolutely can. So we've made good time. It's 11 o'clock. Maury very kindly spoke for us for 90 minutes. I have got a few questions which I'm taking through first. We're about halfway through those. There's a couple of other longer questions we get to in a second tied to that. And then we'll have a little bit more time as well for Q&A. We might even be kind and give Maury an actual break in a second and give everyone a chance to get a glass of water or something. But bear with us now, because Maury hopefully is coming back in a second to take a few more questions. And we have, in theory, got until 12:30. Obviously, we have to see exactly how many questions we can answer in that time. So please do use this time as well to check out the Q&A. You can have a look here and see what's been asked so far. You can upvote. Please definitely do upvote. It's using the arrow on the left-hand side. You can see votes. I'm doing my best to work through the system to see where there are thumbs up as well. That also tells me you want that question answered. But the system officially works on votes. I guess it's a little bit confusing. We're all maybe a bit more used to another platform where there's one option to upvote in Slido and not two, which maybe makes it a little bit easier just to rearrange the display. But as mentioned, I've got a group of questions I'm asking first on the plan. And then secondly, we will try and go beyond that then into some of the other questions that have been asked in chat. And again, we'll use the upvoting to help us steer exactly what that is. And I've got a very nice option which lets me see what's most upvoted. And that will be my guide to ask questions and take them through. But as mentioned, we've picked up some of the quick ones on Interreg Plan, which we'll use first. Are you back with us, Maury?
I'm back.
Lovely. I'm just turning off some cameras so I can actually see. I think I have some bandwidth issues, not just in my head, but also over the internet. Perfect. So we talked that it's not maybe entirely clear on timeline. First adoption maybe plan, followed by then chapters as they come. Related to that, and maybe gets a similar answer, is it in your mind at the minute at least 3 months, when you talk about 3 months for the approval, 4 months for review, are these dates rolling? Are they calendar? Is it sort of the timer starts when the submit button's clicked? How will the timelines that are set out in the regulations, these 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, how will they be considered?
The usual approach, there's been a kind of standardized approach, I think, really since the 1420 period on how we handle these things. Is as soon as something hits the commission desk, the timer starts running. So when the button is clicked, if you like, in SFC, it starts running. If we return documents for revision, observations, etc., then the clock stops. So basically, these would be calendar months running when the task is with us.
That to me now is clear. They were the easy ones. So now I'll go a bit beyond the kind of repeating what you already said. Let's see how far we go here. There was a question we had from the MFF consultation, which we posted in the chat. And when I did the first cut, it was one of the most upvoted questions. And it's about the amount of information that's going to be contained in this summary that goes into the chapter. The requirement you have as a regio unit, rather than you personally, obviously, to review the chapter to make sure it's got enough elements in that you can give it approval, and then also some requirements about provisions concerning management and control system. Specifically on the last one, that seems to be a change to require elements of the DCMS to be in the document. Is that simplification is one question. And secondly, in terms of this character count versus the detail, how do you think that can work in practice?
Well, honestly, I think on the character count and detail, this is just part of an area where people have to change their way of thinking and change their rationale on this kind of thing. I mean, I've seen 1 or 2 questions which read, the size of the annex is not sufficient. It's not sufficient for what? It's sufficient to provide the level of information that the Commission is asking for. Again, if programs want to write much more detailed descriptions that they agree amongst themselves, then fine, you know, but again, there's no legal requirement for that. We just have to change our rationale of thinking that, no, we don't need 100, 150, 300 page programs anymore. We're asking for a core information of 5-10 pages, and that's what people should put together. And they put together the basic facts that are required for each of the sections. On the management and control system description, well, I mean, we've always needed the structure of the authorities, the description of who's in charge, etc. I think that the question in relation to why the provisions on the description, it's linked a little bit to the requirements in relation to the performance-based approach and who's going to be in charge of reviewing those kind of aspects. So remember that this is just extracting a summary of a classic Interreg program, and then we are just going to be approving those aspects. The other aspects that we have traditionally all approved, the other dozens and dozens of pages, simply don't form part of a Commission approval anymore. So it's just this narrowing down the core to the very core of what we need at the chapter level. That's really the thinking on that side.
The next few questions take us away from the chapter specifics and the Interreg specific in terms of our current programs and onto kind of maybe the modalities. In terms of kind of what you're expecting in there, is there any more information you can give us about what we should expect to find in those modalities, or I think the pull quote is direct, detailed arrangements concerning specific implementation modalities. I've got follow-up questions on this on synergies, capitalizations, and small project funds. So you can answer globally or singularly as you prefer, and I'll follow up with you on those other points as well.
I think broadly what I would characterize it. When we were having internal discussions, and I think if you sit down and talk to most of the Interreg community, and you look at the existing Interreg regulation from 21-27, if you ask the question, how much of this Interreg regulation do you really need to deliver Interreg, then I think most people involved in Interreg would say, well, you kind of need all of it. That's why it's there. And it's an element which can prove challenging when discussing with non-Interreg people. One of the internal points that we'd had, without, giving away too many secrets, one of the internal tricky discussions we've had is the list of eligibility of expenditure articles in the Interreg regulation. Because the reaction from central services in the Commission is a lot, why on earth are, well, A, we don't want eligibility of expenditure anymore because we're moving away from that, and B, why on earth have you got so much detail here on something in relation to eligibility of expenditure? Let the member states sort it out. And of course, the answer has to be, well, because member states and the Interreg community asked for it, because it establishes harmonized single sets of eligibility rules that can apply across borders. And there's a lot of the Interreg regulation that exists because it was demanded. It's not that something that the Commission has imposed. The same on small project fund. The reason we legislated for the small project funds for the first time in 21-27 explicitly is because there was significant demand for it. Include that so that we have standardized rules. So our starting point, if you like, is very much we see that the vast majority of what's included in the existing Interreg regulation provides added value for the delivery of Interreg. Therefore, that's our starting point for the thinking on the Interreg plan. The implementing modalities are picking up most of the rest of the Interreg regulation that is not yet included in the ERDF regulation. That's the starting point. There are some elements which will fall. We have articles on thematic concentration. We won't have thematic concentration anymore. That won't exist in the Interreg plan either. So there will some that will not be there. The second aspect is, are there areas where we want to go beyond what we even put down in 21-27? Are there new aspects that might want to be added? And there you might be looking at aspects like capitalization and synergies and elements that have come out in particular from the consultation exercise over the last couple of years. Are there areas there that we want to include, that we want to build in? Slightly perversely, because we'll be talking about a Commission implementing act for the Interreg plan, we might actually end up with more flexibility to include things like that in the plan than we would have been able to do in a Council Parliament regulation. Let's see. There will be people that are enthusiastic about that idea, about legislating for those type of areas. I have to admit, personally, I am cautious about over-regulating. Again, we have a very diverse Interreg community. Legislating for something because it makes a lot of sense on an internal cross-border might create significant difficulties if you're trying to implement an outermost region program on an external border. So again, from a harmonization approach, we need to be careful about over-regulating. But I would say broadly that those are the two areas. We would be looking for the necessary continuity with the existing Interreg regulation on the one hand, and looking to see what we pick up and what we learn from the public consultation exercise with the Interreg programs and new elements that people have been looking for on the other.
You mentioned being conscious of not over-regulating something. In terms of small project funds, things like that, particularly, where they don't necessarily need regulation or rules, do you see there's a way of including them or a need to include them potentially in some way in the Interreg plan in order to acknowledge their existence in a regulatory level? Or is this just not realistic?
Well, I think the Small Project Fund is a very good example of that. There was a clear and unambiguous demand from a significant group of programs and a significant group of member states to legislate for how Small Project Fund should work last time round. And that's why those articles exist in the regulation. There is equally a significant group of programs and member states who say, we don't need anything to do with small project funds and we don't want to use them. Many years ago, Marco and I used to work together on the Karelia program. And this was always one of my defense arguments when people were trying to impose, for example, small project funds everywhere. I said, if you go back and look at something like the Karelia program, you could pretty much argue that every single project we ever funded under the Karelia program in the past was a small project. But we never needed a small project fund. We never needed separate rules or a separate system. The program functioned very effectively with its own approach. So I think the small project fund area is an example where I would think we do need to regulate in the Interreg plan because some programs require it, but it shouldn't be something that's obligatory across Interreg. The challenge that we faced a little bit in the 21-27 discussion, we included text about how small project funds could operate and we included them as optional. And then we faced significant pressure during the negotiations with the European Parliament, which was trying to extend it as an obligation across the entirety of Interreg. So that's also why I'm cautious about over-regulating, because you never know what the consequences could be further down the road.
I guess that equally applies to fees capitalization as kind of other modality points here.
Well, capitalization is one that, you know, is I think a significant challenge. How would you legislate for that to impose a set of standardized approaches for those that want to use it? That's a little bit the challenge of the question there. What would you actually be regulating for? Capitalization and the importance of synergies and sharing knowledge and understanding across programs are hugely important, and are something that we encourage and push and draw attention to on a regular basis. But what would you actually want to regulate and require would be the question, you know, and that's the kind of thing that we would need to look at quite carefully.
Thanks, Murray. I have one more question, and what we're going to do is take a 10-minute break, which is also going to give us a chance to just put down a little bit of structure then to the next batch of questions for Murray. And I think also, Murray, you've been talking now almost for 2 hours, so I think at the very least you deserve a cup of tea as well as a glass of water to get you through the last section. So question has come in the chat quite highly upvoted about the strategic environmental assessment and whether or not that's going to be required. Is it going to be required at the plan level? Is it going to be required within chapters, or is it just not required at all? So that's the strategic environmental assessment.
Yeah, I'm just I'm lining up for one of my favorite answers, which is I don't know. It's not been raised internally, so that's one to follow, I would say.
Perfect. Well, not perfect, but the answer is clear. Okay, so sometimes clear answers is the best we can hope for. As mentioned, we're going to take a little break here. That's going to give Murray a chance to have a cup of tea, get a glass of water, give you all a chance as well to have a comfort break if you need it. We will come back at 11:30, so that's in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. We are at 11:30. There's always a slight challenge because I can't see with the webinar setup that anyone's actually back, but I'm going to ask Maury if he's with me still.
Hi, Kevin, this is me, Petra. I can see Maury's screen, but he's muted. So most probably he's on his way to the computer still.
Okay, perfect. So we'll take a second. What we'll actually do then is jump ahead to the what next section and give Maury just a minute to maybe finish his cup of tea. I want to just confirm in this room we have good news. My colleague Akosh has come in and waved a signed contract at me. So we can confirm a bit of details for the Knowledge Fair, which is planned on the 4th and 5th of November, which is now booked. Haha, we have a venue on the 4th and 5th of November. This obviously for us is the next place where we can have more discussions. The idea is to bring programs together to discuss what we know at this stage. Obviously, Maury's giving us the first glance today. We'll know a little bit more in the coming days and weeks, I guess. And we also have the webinar, not the webinar, sorry, the Knowledge Fair, which is our next chance as a big group to come together and talk about it. We have procured a venue in Dubrovnik in Croatia. Apologies, Croatians, for my pronunciation. Dubrovnik. We have 2 full days on the 4th and 5th of November. We have enough capacity for 2 to 3 people per program, a representative from member state and non-member states participating in Interreg as well. All of this kind of subject to final confirmation and some numbers. There'll be more details of it on Interreg's website. We already have the first details published already now. But please, if you aren't already aware, please save the dates if you're planning to come on behalf of your program or behalf of a member state, particularly a national authority hosting Interreg programs, to talk about the webinar, to talk about the future. We also have a webinar, which I've said 3 times because I know I need to not forget it. That's planned on the 22nd of October. We've already booked the date in people's diaries to make sure we can have another conversation. We'll likely limit that to the attendees of the fair, just because it will also cover quite a lot of logistics about how the 2 days will run. But we'll confirm that when we're absolutely sure on what happens and what we do next. As mentioned, the event is published. I published it this morning. I was very pleased to be able to do that. And the bit you can keep contributing to even after today, the feedback loop we've set up with Microsoft Forms where you can give us observations, that stays open until the end of the month. So you can still, even after today, contribute questions, observations there. That's being taken forward by us. We're trying to understand where your key concerns are. Obviously, we're going to try and deal with some of them in a second, and we'll talk about the performance-based approach in just a minute. Now I've had a chance to actually look at the questions and read them properly, because I am not a PBA specialist, so I'm doing what I can to try and understand the questions as well, which we'll ask. And we've got some more general questions as well, and this is then the chance on the 4th and 5th of November to work through our shared understanding a little bit more again. And again, we're you talking about observations and reflections because, as we heard with the strategic environmental assessment, which is very important to know whether or not you need to do one, we don't know current answer. So we hopefully we can get a more information maybe later, or we can keep the conversation alive to know whether to follow it, to keep asking it. So yeah, we hope to open registration at the latest on Monday. And Petra, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I see Maury is back. So we can continue with the Q&A. And of course, everyone is welcome to Dubrovnik.
Thanks, Petra. So Maury, can I test your microphone? You're here?
Yes, you can.
Perfect. I have a slight challenge that I can't see you because my computer isn't working wonderfully today, but obviously huge excitement. I am starting then first off. I'm going to talk to you or ask you to talk a little bit about the performance-based approach and how it can work with Interreg. And maybe starting with this kind of first, in terms of the concept of it, we've got the concepts of measures, we've got objectives, activities, milestones, targets, the output and result indicators. How are you seeing this in the Interreg context going forward? Is there a kind of non-technical example that you have that you're working with internally, or is there a way you think this is clear for Interreg already?
Very honestly, no, from my side. I have, how shall I put this delicately, happily delegated this kind of reflection to colleagues, which are still ongoing, and of course they've been working with the Interact colleagues and program colleagues on developing this. I think that the principal challenge, I think, in constructing the performance-based approach in Interreg is concerns the fact that, relatively speaking, the Interreg programs are fairly small financially. And that means that they're covering quite a lot of ground, be it in a cross-border or a transnational context. So how do you group together sufficiently actions that you can then measure? I mean, it's not the same rationale as your approach in the recovery and resilience facility, where you have hundreds upon hundreds of millions of euros, and you can say, well, one of our measures is, the example that one of my colleagues always used to quote to me was constructing wind farms. Because that is going to be a sufficient individual measure by itself. It's going to be, you know, a significant amount of money, and you can measure it as a single performance-based approach with a milestone and a target. With the best will in the world under Interreg, if we continue the extension about talking about wind farms, you might have a single project looking at, I don't know, an innovative approach from either a maritime dimension or some kind of cross-border specificity. But clearly that's not going to constitute a measure by itself, because it's going to be a single project. So it's this grouping of the measure aspect that's the key thing. The drive on performance-based approaches inside the Commission is coming on the back of the recovery and resilience process. So the internal thinking is thinking about these larger programs and these larger blocks of money. Now, the downside of that is that there's no specific steer for, relatively speaking, smaller programs like Interreg coming from the inside. The advantage, because you can look at it from the other side of the coin, is that there's no specific steer coming from the inside on this process, which gives us more leeway and more flexibility. I think that, you know, the simple way to pick this up is that this is something that we need to continue talking to each other about and working up an Interreg approach on the question. In the same way as a little bit during the presentation, I talked about an Interreg approach on reform. You know, we need to construct an appropriate angle for our size of programs, for multi-country programs, for the types of activity that we're supporting, and how we deliver on that performance-based dimension. You know, it's difficult to go further at this stage. The fundamental point is that we need to get fully and completely behind it and find the way forward on it. It's not about saying, this is going to be too difficult to apply, we need to go back to expenditure based. That's not going to fly this time round. Politically, fundamentally, we need to demonstrate that we are moving with the times on this as well.
You've used this word measures, which I mean, again, I'm not an FPBA expert. I think you've hinted that you're expertly advising others to be the experts rather than taking it on yourself. But you use this measures concept, which is kind of, you just described it in a way as a group of projects maybe having a similar impact. Is that kind of the idea, that measures are maybe bigger than a single project, but aren't an indicator, so to speak, directly?
Honestly, Kevin, possibly. I mean, I think that's, but, I can't really go further than that at this stage in the process. Huh?
No, that's clear. I think we're all grappling with new terminology, maybe as a kind of friendly reply to that one, to try and understand these. Next one for you, a question directly from the performance-based working group, which you've hinted at a little bit here. You can find details of that group on Interact's website. We've got a networks page where every network is listed, but you can also find out exactly who's in the working group. If you're eager to find out what they're working on and chat to a colleague, not just volunteering here, that you can contact Greg and the others that are leading it, because obviously they can't field 600 phone calls after this meeting. But the detail of the working group is there, and I'm sure they will be a key part of both Knowledge Fair and the webinar. But in terms of this kind of general basis of how performance-based will work, the statement given to me is that reporting achievement of milestones or targets should trigger a payment from an EC to a program. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
That's a wonderfully clear answer. Thank you, Maury. That is my understanding of what the base model is. So for me as an amateur, that confirms some basic understandings. Obviously, Interact is its internal processes with the working group, with the Interreg programs very much taking the lead to try and theorize how it can work. And I don't want to preview too much of the work they're doing, but appreciation to them for doing it. On a commission level, one side is what Interreg programs are doing and expect. Is there any kind of forthcoming guidance, particularly thinking about the national regional partnership plans, that may or may not also be applicable to Interreg, or that we should be aware of? The question here is basically, is there a guidance document in process? Is there kind of more detailed instructions likely to follow? Or are we all investigating the way forward together to kind of politely say no one knows anything more than anybody else at the minute?
Yeah, honestly speaking, more the latter. You're not going to get any kind of guidance document shared while the formal negotiation process on the regulations is going on. Anything where member states raise fundamental concerns and address, ask questions that this is insufficiently clear, we can't understand what's proposed here. What happens in those kind of situations is the Commission could prepare explanatory fiches, which are then shared with the Council Working Group. And that's, but it's more a judgment call from the Commission side whether these kind of things are necessary. So that could be one area. If, for example, member states were to raise the issue that there is insufficient clarity on how performance-based approach is going to function across the NRPs or across Interreg, we asked the Commission for more explanations of this, then there might be an explanatory fiche created that would be shared through the Council Working Group. But you're not going to see anything shared outside that negotiation structure at this stage, because that undermines the negotiation process.
Sure, no, that's clear. Maybe then taking it back into kind of the general PBA, maybe also you have information from the RRF side. We've got kind of questions we've seen on the kind of scale of achievement. If I guess this is going to be very difficult to ask without kind of going, well, it depends on the project, I guess. If something achieves sort of 80% of what was foreseen, is that will that mean 100% hasn't achieved no payment, or will that have some measure or some ability to have scales of payments based on part achievement, or sometimes factors change the full amount of a project that can be delivered? In a PBA model, missing the final payment can be quite painful. Do you have any kind of advice or ideas or anything you've seen from the RRF application to give you confidence in answering that?
I think that's an extraordinarily difficult question to pick up at this stage in the process. The rationale, I would say, behind the performance-based approach is that you hit your targets or you don't. Because otherwise you've either performed or you haven't. And the question, in a sense, is not so much if you deliver 80% or 100%, because if you deliver 80%, you've not hit your target. The question is rather, have you constructed an appropriate system of milestones and targets so that sufficient funding flows? Because, again, with this kind of performance-based system, it's not about saying, right, you will get 200 million euros if you construct a wind farm of 50 windmills, full stop. You know, it's not a single point in time, i.e. you deliver all 50 or you get nothing. It needs to be a set of milestones along the way. And those can be discussed and negotiated, and at least from what I've seen in the context of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, renegotiated and modified during implementation, so that you are delivering along the way. I did a reasonable amount of work before I came back to Interreg on an example financing not linked to cost example that Austria was introducing on energy efficiency. And this was one of the key discussion points. How do you construct the timeline of activities? If you're dealing with expenditure, every time you spend something, you get a bill. And once you've added up 2 or 3 bills, you can make a claim to a project and you get part of the money. But you've no necessarily knowledge at that stage whether anything is advancing successfully. You've spent a bit of money, but what's going to be the end result? The system that we had when we were talking with the Austrians on that energy efficiency example was, well, let's say when you publish your first call for projects, that liberates a 10% payment from the Commission. When you have completed contracting for X% of the budget, that releases another 10% of the funding. So that you're not tying the delivery to a, if I can put it like that, an absolutely 100% completely successful delivery right at the end of the process. There's stages along the way, because you also have to liberate the funding along the way. Otherwise, the program's not going to function. Because if none of the money is paid until the projects are completed, there's no way to actually deliver that process. So that's also one of the elements that needs to be looked at in more detail. But the idea that you have a target at the end saying that if you deliver 100%, you get paid X, is not going to, you know, saying that, well, we've done 80% of it, that's not going to be a deliverable because you've not hit the target. Again, sorry, Kevin, I'm going to need to take just a minute or two, okay?
No problem, Murray. I guess as you're saying that, the thing that's my mind is turning to, having thought about the cash flow here, it's the milestones along the way releasing payments. So in effect, the answer here on 8 out of 10 might be, as long as the indicators along the way, the milestones along the way are accurate, you've already got 70% of the funding, even if you haven't achieved 100% of the original plan. I'm not the PBA expert, so I'm very happy that there are a working group also looking into this. That gives some answer there, I hope. In the meantime, I am still working through the Q&A. I'm closing off. We have a section of questions on PBA, which we're midway through. We're going to talk about roles and relationships in PBA in a second. And then we've got a final few round of questions a bit more broadly that I've got planned. I will still update this, so please do have a look at the Q&A. You can still upvote things. The top question about verifications and MAs is my not quite next question, but it's in there in terms of this roles and relationship. And I hope for those contributing questions and voting, you can see that things are starting to be answered in terms of what's there. Obviously, what we're doing is trying to group this in a sensible way to have a conversation with Maury where particularly on PBA, things aren't necessarily 100% clear. And that should hopefully give us a little bit of an overview of the thinking, at least, if not kind of the specifics on the rules. And Mari, feel free to interrupt me when you're back.
Okay, I'm here. I'm multitasking. Apologies for that. But if you go on with the questions, and I'll try and handle them as best I can.
Perfect. Actually, I told a lie. The next question is about the role of the MA in verifying targets and milestones. That's clear. In terms of the rest of the rules, public procurement, state aid, does that reside with the MA as responsibility? Because the challenge here is obviously if things on a lower level, I guess this is on PBA basis, you're paying for the performance, how are you also applying state aid rules?
Again, for later discussion, I think, on the detail, quite frankly. But ultimately, the simple answer on that, the managing authority remains responsible for implementation towards us and all aspects of implementation.
I'm going to pick up that answer because I think that's wonderfully demonstrating the next set of questions, which is we're talking about relationships, especially the relationship between the commission and program on a performance-based level, which is clear in the regulations. I mean, not necessarily clear in the regulations, but the intention to have it is clearly set out. The managing authority then has some other challenges to deal with in terms of auditors, especially. This is where I've got 3 questions specifically on the role of auditors. The first one, I really like this question is, could we, instead of having auditors, have an evaluation authority as a concept? Maybe it's still auditors doing the work because it still has the same quality level, but it's a slightly different approach in terms of real costs versus the milestone verification point or the milestone assessment. I mean, presumably auditors as a concept is fairly fixed.
Yeah, this is the kind of question I really, I don't see too much point in getting into, Kevin, in the sense that the Commission hasn't proposed evaluation. We proposed an approach on audit. That's what the Commission proposal is. That's what, I think rethinking concepts at this stage in the process is not really the direction to go in a sense. It's reacting to what the Commission has put on the table. If people are not happy with it, then that's where they can raise issues via their member state representatives in council. But creating brand new ideas that aren't included there is.
I'm not sure if it's just mine, Murray, but with slight technical challenges with your microphone there. But noted, difficult to reopen concepts. One of the other questions related to this, but not so challenging, hopefully. We had a comment that there's not a mention in the regulation on the current common audit sample. Is that expected to be part of the definition in the future, or is that changing with the nature of the new setup?
That's one of the elements that we would want to pick up in the Interreg plan. That's been a major success story. I guess people have seen, I don't know if they've heard, but I think the common sample error rate first time round came out at something like 0.07%. So this is something that we would want to pick up and continue in the Interreg plan.
Thank you. The good news, I think that's PBA covered in terms of the questions that came in. I know that's not necessarily as much clarity as some people were hoping for, but thank you, Maury, for saying what you can say, and also hopefully that gives some steer for colleagues in terms of thinking going forward. This is I think just take the floor in a second with an Interact hat on. This is an ongoing discussion on PBA and how it works in Interreg. Some of the challenges around the exact way in which people work and monitor Interreg projects and programs, I think is clearly going to be a challenge in terms of changes. We hear that some of the challenges programs have with SCOs even, and moving various people away from real costs under the SCOs. But I think we hear that as an ongoing discussion we need to have as well. The next question, Maury, maybe we come back away from the level of detail and just maybe ask you, gazing into a crystal ball, if we think about the timeline a little bit, what do you see as kind of the realistic time that we are looking at starting implementation? This ties a little bit to the fact that there's zero implementation foreseen in 2028. Is that when we see realistically, by the time negotiations, and I know you can't answer when the negotiations are going to conclude, but in the timeline of past negotiations and the theory of what's possible, is 2028 a realistic, not even first year of Interreg, but 2029 then being the first year? Or do you see much that can be said at this point on that timeline?
It's obviously very uncertain. I think there's an inevitability of the financial discussions, so not the specific Interreg, the whole MFF budget discussions, running to the very last minute of the overall process. So you would expect, based on previous experience, funding, overall budget package is not going to be finalized until mid to late 2027. Mm-hmm. If you get a nice surprise, you might get it in early 2027, but you know, I wouldn't put money on it. Regulatory wise, nothing can be adopted until the budget is fixed. You can progress obviously on the negotiation framework and the content, but only once the budget is fixed can you actually plug in the right numbers into each piece of legislation and finalize each piece of legislation. So you're pushing the legislation to late 2027 based on that timeline. The added uncertainty we have in the Interreg context is precisely the fact that there's no budget in 2028 in the proposal. Is that an oversight? Was it an error? Was it deliberate? Will it be changed? That adds an additional layer of uncertainty into that process. What I would say as an Interreg community, we should be aiming to be ready to start in 2028 implementation. And why do I say that? Because the budget may change. And there is no point in us going, okay, well, the Commission proposal says 2029 is the first year of allocations, therefore we won't aim to be ready until 2029. And then if the MFF is changed, we're suddenly running 12 months late. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, Interreg implementation is more advanced in this programming period than we've ever seen before. Yes, we're still behind on the payment curve out of the EU budget, but the execution rate inside programs, commitment at project level, you know, we have a significant number of programs that are basically finished. It's now accompanying project implementation because there's no more money available for project selection. So there are a lot of programs that are essentially already, you know, casting their eyes to the horizon and saying, well, what about next period? We need to start planning. We need to start thinking on this. And again, from our side, and when I say our, I mean particularly the Interreg people in the Commission, not just the Commission generally, you know, we don't want to lose the momentum that we have now. This is part of our acceleration exercise, and it's also part of the internal discussion we will have with colleagues in other parts of the Commission. You know, if I can go along and say, well, excuse me, in my programs in Unit D1, we're at 75% commitment to projects, and I have about 10 programs that have no money left because we're already ready. It's telling a story about how much Interreg has accelerated, how much the Interreg system is working, and being ready to start at the beginning of the next period is part of that process. So it's not about instilling panic. It's not that we have to be ready tomorrow, but we need to start moving is a little bit the message, I think, on this, and we have the ability and the capacity to do so better than we've ever done before, and that's kind of what I would say on the timing.
There's a related question to that, which I've just seen added a few minutes ago, in terms of who should start and when should people start. We've talked a little bit, you mentioned that it's sort of up to member states if they want to change where the chapters and plans will be. Is there anything currently in terms of starting those discussions? Do existing programs start? Is there something from somewhere else that's going to trigger an official start, or do programs start working with their monitoring committees and member states to talk about their future?
The latter, there's no official start date. There's no, starter gun that gets fired at any point in this kind of process. We never legislate for, you have to start doing X and Y by Z in order to get ready for whatever date. So it's very much an internal process and internal responsibility of the program partnership to kind of take that forward. What we will be doing on the Commission side, the intention is very much to take forward the orientation paper approach that we worked through last time, where we share, if you like, an informal Commission reflection on the future direction of individual programs. And we would want to put those on the table in the course of 2026. And no, I don't have a more precise timeline at this stage. In order to, as I say, share some reflections about what the Commission is thinking, the direction the Commission would like to see, and help stimulate the discussion and debate inside the programs. Again, part of the rationale we have is, particularly when we look at the 2026 timeline, we will be in a situation where ever more of the existing Interreg programs have no funding left to allocate. So they will not be organising calls for projects. They will not be encouraging directly potential project beneficiaries to be creating project applications, etc., because there will be no calls running. They will be accompanying and monitoring the existing projects and following those to conclusion, but in principle, that means that there will be more space inside the system precisely to start looking at the future earlier than we've ever done before.
One of the other elements that's been asked in the chat is also a little bit where it doesn't have a space in terms of the macro-regional strategies, and in the next period. Is there expectation? I mean, obviously they exist semi-outside and also semi-inside. Where do they find their space?
Yeah,
in terms of the future funds regulations and the Interreg plan, especially.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, obviously, when people talk about macro-regional strategies, they always kind of identify that close link with Interreg. It's actually, interestingly, it's one of the points that I've tried to downplay to a certain extent. Because yes, most of the funding, or a lot of the funding that comes for supporting macro-regional strategies, and particularly supporting the organisation and implementation of macro-regional strategies comes through Interreg. But the rationale from the very beginning has always been that macro-regional strategies are much more than that. And they should be looking at a very wide range of potential funding sources, other parts of the EU budget, national budget, regional budgets. It's not simply about an Interreg story. That's the first point. Second point, we are also drawing lessons from the discussions last time round. We ran into significant headwind with member states in the regulatory references to macro-regional strategies. Member states wanted a real minimum of references in the cohesion regulations last time round. And you will have seen that, from implementing the programs in the 21-27 period. The references there on macro-regional strategies are very light. Third element is we come back to the regulatory structure that's part of the Commission proposal this time round. We've got 7 Interreg articles at the Council Parliament regulation level. That was as much as we could achieve as part of this process. Essentially, there was that internal discussion where I've referred to that a bit. When you look at the current Interreg regulation, you have 60 odd articles for the Interreg community. All of those are relevant. The internal discussion was there's no way you're having 60 articles inside a council parliament regulation this time round. That's the reality of the situation. So we got what we could achieve. Other elements that we're going to use, we need to pick up and look at the possibilities in the Interreg plan and what we want to include there. But again, the final word in relation to the macro-regional strategies are, and you alluded to this, Kevin, they are a unique and strange beast. They are not regulated in any way whatsoever. There's no overarching set of rules that govern how a macro-regional strategy functions. They are not tied to the MFF, they are not tied to implementation periods, and they operate in a strange mid-location somewhere between intergovernmental cooperation and the EU framework. So again, there is a question exactly how much legislative elements would people want to be including in this kind of context. One of the elements that's worth picking up to show is that in the existing Interreg regulation, we have this clause where 80% of a transnational programme that is attached to a macro-regional area needs to be used to help deliver the macro-regional strategy. And that was part of the thematic concentration discussion last time round. But we don't have thematic concentration anymore. Therefore, that sentence doesn't exist. And that won't exist even in the Interreg plan. So it's an area where we need to have a look, carefully as the thinking on the plan evolves about exactly how much we want to say on that. And how much we can say on it, perhaps, as well.
Yeah. We have had a very, very nice session with you. We've got one last question, which is one of my personal hobby horses. That's not why it's in. It's from the upvoting. And it's about this kind of data framework in the next period. A little bit set against maybe some of the data and moving to less information in terms of PBA, but also more generally, there are quite a few clauses on data and the way information should flow between projects, programs, and commission. What's the underlying thinking here in terms of how data is to be used in the next period? And I think this is a very different question to when we asked it about the period ahead, given how quickly technology is moving, particularly around what the importance for data for feeding AI models and things like that as well. But not to get into AI, but more of a simple question. I don't know if it's a simple question, but more of an overview question in terms of the rationale or the idea behind the clauses you've seen on data, and what people are hoping is going to come from these clauses, or what the data world will look like for not just Interreg, but wider cohesion, wider national regional partnership plan funding in the next period.
If I work backwards on that as well, I think what it means for Interreg and how this will impact upon us, I think it's probably too early to say. And the reason for that is that the driving rationale behind all of the approach on data, on indicators, on the mechanics of that process, has been driven at the budget level as a whole. I mean, this has really been a full-on comprehensive process for how the Commission can report on the effectiveness and the delivery of the EU budget as a whole. It's something that started really towards the end of the negotiation process of the last set of regulations. So you can trace this back already to 2020, and the finalization of the last set of regulations. And some of our budget and finance colleagues at that stage were trying to add elements into various regulations in order to be able to have a more harmonized approach of reporting and analysis and numbers and data at the budget level. It didn't really work because you can't add things that late in the process. You ran into significant resistance from member states and Parliament saying, hang on, this wasn't as part of the initial Commission proposal. You can't kind of slide it under the door late on. They got some elements of that in. So at the time, there was a real fixation on, ultimate beneficiaries, who actually gets hold of the funding right at the bottom of the, who's the ultimate owners, ultimate beneficiaries of funding, this kind of thing. And we got this additional annex, which I can't remember now, was it 17 or 18, which in the CPR, which set out a lot of detail that had to be recorded for each individual project. And there were elements there about ultimate owners, also ultimate beneficiaries in relation to public procurement, etc. But that was really, if you like, a first step along the way. And this time round, this is much more systematic right across the network. It also explains why you have a performance framework regulation at the top level tied to the budget, because that's what they want to report on. And that's fine when you're talking about the effectiveness of the overall system and the effectiveness of the budget, etc. But that doesn't really help you if you're reporting on specific parts of the process. And if you're talking about how are we doing in cross-border, transnational and interregional cooperation, and how are we delivering in the context of Interreg? If you're taking those super top-level numbers, that's not really going to help us. So how that translates down and how we then use it at the Interreg level is one of the things that I think we also need to develop. But that's a little bit it gives you the rationale behind the whole process. It's very much top-level driven.
I think that's really helpful as an answer in terms of understanding what's driving this. Obviously, I see the word data and pick up, because if this is automated, I don't need to do research. I just click a button and it appears. But I take the point, this is very much driven, and that clearly is something to bear in mind in terms of where we ask or what we think is being asked. We're now officially at the end of the Q&A. Obviously, we've got a little time left in the meeting, which is my chance to share with you the evaluation link, and my colleague Mercedes is also going to drop this into the chat, so you can simply click a link, or you can scan the QR code on screen. Please do just take a minute to fill out the very short form where you don't need to log in, to let us know how you're getting on. This is something that for us is extremely important. Especially in these big webinars, we can see these potentially being useful going forwards. So please do tell us what worked and what didn't work, especially. And as that's there, I also shared the link in the chat on the previous link. So first, please fill out the evaluation form. Secondly, check out the link to the news post on how to share observations after the event. As we hopefully said at the start and was clear, not everything can be answered now. Maury, I really appreciate how much you were able to talk to us about what's in there. But if you feel that you didn't get a full answer, or if you feel that there's something else to add, please do use that tool. It's open until the 30th of September. Interact is going to use that very much to help us steer some of our work in the coming months. 2026 clearly going to be a very key year for us all. And not just for the orientation papers, which we hope to see. But in terms of where we are now, first, thanks, Maury, for the detail and the discussion today. Thank you for generously speaking for the best part of 3 hours to us. We've got a lot of information there to process. The webinar will be recorded, or is recorded. The recording will be available. I really want to thank you all for your active contributions and to making the Q&A chat function. I hope you feel that we took those questions forward in a sensible way. Again, if you don't feel like you got your answer, please use the links, the second link, the observations link to the news post. That will help you contribute afterwards. And that's open, as I said, to the 30th of September. For those likely to come to the Knowledge Fair, please make sure you save the date 4th and 5th of November, as well as the 22nd of October. All this information will be on Interact's website as well afterwards. And that's it from us. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope the 3 hours were good, interesting, and useful for you. We won't be opening the floor up, so please do use the links to provide additional feedback. Thank you very much for your participation today, and happy Friday, happy weekend for you when it arrives, and we look forward to seeing you and being in contact with you at future Interact events as well. So thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.